My name is Jeanine Tesori. I'm a composer living in New York City, and I'm about to interview Stephen Schwartz, one of the great American musical theater storytellers. Even for people who may not know his name, they know his work. Between Wicked and Godspell, Pocahontas, and Pippin, he's just deeply embedded inside this culture. Stephen has been able to capture lightning in a bottle more than once. He always manages to, I think, capture what people want to see. And that's the other part of it. You can write something, but it can be 10 years before its time. And he's able to do it right at its time. I think he influenced huge, huge numbers of people, myself included, to find their way into theater through the piano. I didn't own any cast albums. I wasn't a theater kid, but I had one vocal selection book, and that was Pippin. And I remember his picture. I can see it right now. And I thought, oh my God, that's what a hip Broadway writer looks like.
Hi, how are you? Oh, nice to see you. Thank you so much for doing this.
I'm so excited.
Yeah, this should be fun.
This is all the things I've wanted to ask you since 1986. I've been storing
I
them.
hope I remember some of them. So, office.
Wow.
Here we are.
This, I love this.
Yeah, that's a Vanity Fair
my-
picture.
Right,
They
right.
look a little plastic, frankly, I think.
Do you?
But it's still nice to have it.
South Park.
Yes, I'm so proud
God.
that I was a character on South Park.
So it's Andrew Lloyd Webber, you.
Elton John, and this is
John.
supposed
Is
to be
that
Steve
Sondheim?
Sondheim, but it looks like Steven Spielberg.
Oh
It's a really funny episode. This is the cast of Du Gluckner for Notre Dame when we were rehearsing before it went off to Berlin. And this very young kid here wound up being the librettist for this show I just did in
Right, that's one of
Vienna.
the things I want to talk to you about.
So you, of all people, will like this, okay? So look at this one. Please notice something about it. It's peeling. See? And everyone keeps saying to me, why don't you go and they'll recode it? But I love this. Look how thin the gold is. How it's the thinnest veneer of gold leaf.
like
And
my
underneath it is just like this gray whatever.
Isn't it the
lead.
best metaphor?
It's perfect.
so
I know.
great.
I know. So I will never ever have it fixed because
Okay,
of that.
can I
It's
hold-
perfect.
hold
Yes, and you'll see. You'll be like, oh,
Remember,
it's so
you know
heavy.
that, so that, oh, it is
See?
heavy. It's the,
I don't care. I don't care how much it peels, as long as there's some gold veneer on
Wow.
it. And I just leave the little shavings off.
That is really incredible that it peels like that.
I know. Isn't it cool?
It is really
I think
cool.
it's so funny.
Which one was that for?
This is one of the Pocahontas ones, I
Right.
think. It'll say on it. I think it's the score one.
And that?
Oh, that was just something from Mexico that was lying around, and I didn't know what else to put on top of this.
That's
And
how I
it
feel
seems
in the
like a
first
sort of-
preview. It's just
Right,
like,
exactly.
Oh, whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, the whatever goddess.
That's beautiful. I love this. so
Thank you.
much. Can we go to the other wall?
Sure.
Wow. Beautiful.
Eventually, I want, the whole wall to be filled with.
Well, oh, wait. Is this a rubbing?
Yes, in the cemetery from Lenny's grave.
Right.
He was the closest thing I had to a mentor, even though, we only worked together for a period of several months in 1 year in 1971.
Right.
That's from some performance of Mass, me with a great deal of hair over there, too. This is my favorite picture from Mass, though, okay? Because I think it looks like a still from The Godfather
It really
movie,
does.
and I've cast the entire thing. But I feel like Godfather, Michael Corleone,
Right. Fredo.
Gordon Davidson as Sonny,
Sonny.
Maurice Press as Fredo,
Right.
and then Tito and Clemenza. Roger Stevens.
That is a crazy shot.
Yeah, so I love it. The thing that I most remember about him was he was the most generous person I ever met. And I don't mean about bestowing money, but how he treated people, how he talked to people, how he would relate to each of them, and how kind he was to, if somebody was a dresser, if somebody was a driver, you know. I would see how he treated people when he was probably the most famous musician in the world. And I just thought, if I ever get to be anywhere near his position or stature, I want to remember that's how you treat people. So that was a great lesson.
And when you teach, you remind me of
Oh,
it.
thank you. He was so important to me, and his sister, Shirley, was my agent.
Was your agent, that's right.
And her picture that she gave me is on my piano in Connecticut, which is actually where I work, so she's always sort of watching me.
Why do you write in Connecticut?
Well, to me in New York, there's always this energy.
The thing.
Which in some ways can be fun and exciting, but to me is not conducive to sort of going into the meditative state that you want to be in, or just the open state that you want to be in when you write. And I also like to wander around from room to room and, you know, fling myself down on a couch for a while. You know, you and I are keyboard players.
Yeah.
Do you write at the keyboard?
I don't write at the keyboard as much now.
See, I'm filled with admiration for your ability to do that. And I used to have conversations with Lenny about that, because he also would write away from the keyboard, but I can't really do it. Because I don't know what's going to come out of my fingers. A lot of it feels like discovery to me, like put yourself in the place of the character, or the story, or the emotion, and, you know, maybe have some vague title or idea in mind, and then see what comes out of your hands. And a lot of times it's a surprise, you know? And I feel if I'm sort of away trying to hear it in my head, maybe it's just a lack of skill on my part, but it doesn't happen for me in the same way as a sort of visceral reaction to hands on a keyboard.
Or are there particular keys that you go to?
No, in fact, I tried in you know, in the course of the show.
Right, because changing up, when you look at D flat and you're thinking about that change as opposed to C, just a half step up, that's a world away.
Yeah.
And
What's
move
your
that
favorite
same
key?
way.
Because you've already mentioned mine.
Is it D flat?
D flat is my favorite key.
I love D flat too.
It's the best key on the piano.
It is the best key.
It's the one that has the most richness.
I agree. Funny.
But I find that because I'm writing at the keyboard and sort of singing over it, I need to be in a bunch of different keys, because then you start the melody in different places, and, you know, then there's not as much of a sameness over the course of an entire score.
Right.
If, you know, one song is written in A flat, and let's say the next one, well, let me do this in D or E or something, and it'll just melodically make a difference.
Right.
But again, for me, that's a rationale about writing at the piano and just, you know, seeing what comes out.
You know, I've told this to you many times, but I think the way that you have used rhythm and melody has ushered in the era that we're in. You ushered in. I firmly.
Well, thank you for saying that.
Absolutely true, and we all know it.
There were very few of us in the early 70s using pop music, or what we would call pop music, to tell stories in the theater. But as you know, when that first was happening, it was much criticized.
Yeah.
And the thought was like, well, you can't use, you can do Hair with pop music, or even Godspell, but you can't actually have characters and tell a story using pop music. Then you have to revert to traditional theater music. And of course, as you say, that's no longer the case, but for a while that was a truism.
Join us, leave your field to flower. Join us, leave your cheese to sour. Join us, come and waste an hour or two.
I feel like I have waited my whole life in order to sit across the table from you and really talk with you about your career, musician to musician. There are many things I love about your music and your lyrics, but there is an unparalleled joy in what you do. I'm wondering what in your studies prepared you for that?
I'm not sure it is something that comes from studies. You know, you and I share this, you know, music feels good. It feels good when you connect with it to listen to it. It feels good to play. It feels good to sing. And so even sort of the saddest or the angriest song has the joy of music contained within it. I know when I do master classes with aspiring musical theater performers, we talk specifically about this. You know, don't forget that part of the subtext of what you are doing when you perform is sharing the joy of making music.
If you could speak about your training as a young person musically, because I feel like there is a beautiful balance of classical, pop, and folk.
Yeah, I mean, I was classically trained. I took piano for 8 or 9 years and then went to Juilliard while I was in high school, continued to study classical piano a little bit, but also switched into composition. Then, you know, played guitar, a lot of folk guitar, before you could then do guitar on the keyboard. My parents were big folk music buffs. So I grew up loving, you know, folk groups like the Weavers, who were very influential on me. And they were big theater goers. So musical theater was something that I experienced from a very young age. But I was not a big pop music aficionado. It really was with the advent of the singer-songwriters of the 60s, with Joni Mitchell and Paul Simon and James Taylor, the Beatles, of course, Burt Bacharach, and the Motown sound. All of that was happening, and suddenly I heard this, and it was a whole new sound that I fell in love with. And so consequently, when I started writing shows, because that was what I was listening to, that sort of became the genre that I was working in.
Right.
My piano teacher would laugh at me because the official category of music that I wasn't so crazy about was so-called romantic music.
Right.
Like I never really loved playing Chopin or anything like that. And I, you know, when I said that to him one time, he laughed at me and he said, You're the most romantic student I've ever had. You make Bach inventions sound romantic.
Right, and you're a romantic writer.
Well,
I feel
exactly.
like you are. You're,
Yeah,
you know,
no, definitely.
It's like a lot of things firing at once, and I feel like you were the first person who really understood that I think a musical is rhythm inevitability, and I think you put this rhythm, a very contemporary rhythm, inside these block piano chords, so it wasn't just about adding percussion. It was inside it, you know, and even in Wicked, when bong, gong, 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 it's done. You know, you understand the force behind it. And that show for you, it came to you.
Yeah, in the most random way. If I was the kind of person who believed in fate and the universe having a plan for you, this story would illustrate it because I was in Los Angeles working on animated features. I had basically left theater behind because it just was too difficult and I was tired of being beaten up and I was having a very happy life doing movies. And then I got a call from my good friend, the composer and accompanist, John Bacchino, and he said, you know, I'm here in Maui. I'm accompanying Holly at an event she's doing. Do you want to come over and visit and just hang out and go to the beach? And the last day that we were there, just for fun, we went snorkeling. And Holly said, sort of out of the blue, oh, I'm reading this really interesting book. It's called Wicked, and it's by this guy named Gregory Maguire. And it's kind of the Oz story from the Wicked Witch's point of view. And like it's done it again. Like every hair on my arms and back of my neck stood up, and I just thought, that's the best idea I've ever heard, and it's so perfect for me in so many ways. But yeah, it just dropped into my lap out of the blue. But I think that's how ideas happen, you know? You sort of...
I do think it's how ideas happen, but like anything else, it takes another person with perseverance to follow that. There's also such beauty behind an idea that comes from one individual, as William Goldman would have said, you know, in The Season, it's the muscle.
Yeah.
And I feel like you were the muscle of that because it started with you.
But that's the interesting quandary about doing musical theater, which I really love, but it's always fraught, which is that it's probably the most collaborative art form.
Yes.
And you better not do it if you don't like collaboration, and you better not do it if you don't know how to collaborate. And that took me a while to learn, frankly. It took a
I mean,
while.
you've worked with so many great directors. The Bob Fosse tradition, where human rights didn't really enter the equation, this is my room and this is how it's going to go. Is there anything that you learned from that you still use?
Sure. Well, how to deal with people like that. What battles to have, when to let things go, when to insist on something and just stand your ground, how to do it. How do you sort of cajole people into doing something the way you see it? And it doesn't always work. When I worked with Bob Fosse, I was 24 years old. I had just done Godspell, where I was sort of the senior partner in the room of all the people working on it. So, I walked into that situation with Bob the first time I was doing a Broadway show, very naive about how this worked. And it was really, a big splash of cold water in the face to find out, this is what it's like to do, professional theater. And I was not prepared for it, and I didn't handle it very well, to be honest. I mean, ultimately, the show worked out. And ultimately, I think the struggle between Bob and myself made the show work in a way that it would not have if either of us had completely gotten our way.
Right.
It's funny now that I'm older considerably than Bob was when he directed the show. I see it so much more from his point of view, and in some ironic way, I've become the guardian of his vision to a certain extent. So I often say, Bob is looking up from somewhere and laughing.
It is the beauty of theater. I feel like there's, you're riding on this train and all the people in your life and your training, and you think about Bob, and then you connect at this train station and you make a work, and you've brought all of your influences, so suddenly you come up with something, as you said, neither of you would have done on your own, and that is, to me, theater at its best. And how did it bring you to can you talk about your latest work, which I'm very excited, about, and the partnership?
Well, I mean, we're not quite sure whether it's a musical or whether it's an opera about the tempestuous relationship between an 18th century theatrical impresario named Emanuel Schikaneder and his wife, Eleonora. And the final scene of this show is opening night of the Magic Flute, where in sort of almost in spite of themselves, they save their relationship and they save their theater with the creation of this work. And Mozart, as a character, is never seen, though his music obviously is heard. And I sort of wrote, in the style of Mozart, I wrote an overture for the first time in my life, which is kind of a Mozart overture. I had to work with, because it was state-supported in Vienna, I had basically the Magic Flute Orchestra plus a harpsichord.
I can't see that would have been in your planning to write a kind of show like that even 5 years ago.
No, but I just thought it was a great idea. And again, as when I heard about Wicked, I thought, well, that's so me, It's always sort of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in some way. It's always that there's something that the audience knows, but then you're shifting the point of view and coming at it from a different way. And it's as if the camera shot that you're aware of has ended, but now the camera's still running, or the camera moves, and you're suddenly looking at a different perspective. I don't know why I find that so interesting.
Well, it's also a powerful way to start something.
Exactly.
Like, I remember sitting in Wicked thinking, oh my God, we all know this already, so we're already united. We're already in agreement when we begin.
That's a really good way to put it. I hadn't thought of
knowledge.
that. But yes, the fact that the audience, I hadn't thought of that word, but I love that the audience comes in some way united.
Yes.
And thus, when you turn it on its head or turn it aside.
And I think that very strange tennis game between an audience and it's the writers and the actors who are completely unknowing and innocent of the moment and completely knowing where they're going to lead us is the most beautiful. And yet, I know when I'm at a first preview, I just want to vomit. It's so frightening. After all of this work that you're doing, have done, and will do, does it get easier, that putting yourself out there?
That's a good question. It's difficult for me personally in New York. And I suspect it would be difficult for me in the West End, where there's this enormous kind of commercial pressure in it. I mean, I don't know what your experience is in New York, but my feeling is that there's a whole group of people who are just dying to see you fail.
Well, that's true.
And that's not a good place to make yourself really vulnerable.
I think there's a sense, for me, competition is good, but I can't wait for you to go down. That's different.
That's not, I was
That's
going to
not
say, it
competition.
depends what you define
Yeah.
as competition. I mean, you were talking about tennis before, and I read this wonderful book years ago when I was playing more competitively, in fact, called The Inner Game of Tennis.
Yeah.
And one of the things in that book, it's by Tim Galway, that he points out is if you're doing a sport like skiing or surfing, you are not choosing the easiest wave, the most gentle hill. You are competing with yourself to try and rise to the greatest height you can. And therefore, as he says in tennis, you should not be rooting for your opponent to play badly or to double fault or to give you the game. You should root for your opponent to play as well as he or she possibly can,
Yeah.
and thus have to elevate your own game
Yeah.
to meet it. And I think that's what you're saying.
Yes.
When I look at your work, when I look at the work of other writers here, and I really admire it, and I think, you know, how did she do that? I wouldn't have seen my way clear to do that. It lifts your own game.
There's a circle here. I think, like back in the day when composers would take each other's themes and write variations because they admired them. And it wasn't sort of a, you know, piss off. It was, I admire your work. I want to type out that to just feel what it's like to do that.
This is why I have so much trouble with the concept of awards, you know, because I feel as if that's the wrong kind of competition. And look, I mean, we both won awards. They're nice to win. It feels good and it's helpful to you in your career. And of course, from a marketing point of view, it can be good for the project. But when that tail starts to wag the dog, as I feel starts to happen, and it's happened more and more and more, that's really self-defeating. I remember back in the 70s when Pippin opened, and it opened in October, and no one mentioned anything about Tony Awards. And then in the spring, it got nominated for several awards, and I got, you know, a phone call from my agent, and she said, "Oh, you've been nominated for these awards. Isn't that nice? You know, this many Tony Awards." End of story until the night of the awards presentation. Great, you know, we won some, we lost some, whatever, it was all good. The day after Wicked opened, also in October, all anybody talked about was, how many Tony Awards do you think it's gonna be nominated for? You know, is this gonna win, is that gonna win? It was such a shock to me how it had changed, and I felt not for the better. And so we, as writers or artists, we have to have the internal strength to put on the blinders and not look at that. And just keep our eyes on the prize.
I know that
and
a
not
lot
that
of-
prize.
So what is that process like? I mean, the minute that you have that moment of this story is worth spending 5 or 6 years of my life, that we know that moment, to sitting down at the piano.
I think both you and I share the basic goal of telling a story. There's the reason we take on a project is there is something about that story that is compelling to us, something that lives in us and that we want to share through that story or through those characters. So the first thing for me is to work out the story with my collaborators. For instance, on Wicked, Winnie Holzman, the book writer, and I spent about a year just working out the outline of the show. And of course, I had played around with certain musical themes, including the Defying Gravity motif that you mentioned earlier, and just had them sort of filed away somewhere, like, this sounds like that character, maybe I'll use this in some way. But basically, we were just figuring out the story. And then once we had a basic outline, Then Winnie would write some things just to see how they talk and what's the language and what's the flow. And I would begin to write songs. We would look at the whole piece together and kind of song spot, like this feels like it should be musicalized. This whole sequence feels like a musical section, et cetera. And I just always pick the path of least resistance. I start with the song that is clearest to me at the beginning. It's very, very rarely the first number.
Yeah, ditto, right.
And, you know, I think it was E.L. Doctorow said about writing, and he, of course, was talking about novels, but I feel it's true for everything. He said it's like driving in a very thick fog. You are aware of your destination, but you can't see it. You just kind of know what direction to go in, and all you can see is 5 feet in front of you. So you drive that 5 feet, and then you can see the next 5 feet, and you just keep going that way. And so by the path of least resistance, you're taking the 5 feet that you can see. And very often the first few things that I write for a show don't wind up in the show.
For sure.
Or if they do, they're virtually never exactly as I wrote them the first time.
Do you think, I'm going to write these songs, they'll probably get cut, but I'm going to write them 100% with that intention and dedication, 100% that they might be failures?
Absolutely, but you write as if.
Yes,
you write as
right.
if everything is going to be perfect, everything is going to be exactly what you want, you commit to it completely, you go through the pain and struggle, and then the minute it's done, you have to be willing to let it go. You have to just be able to do that, and I find theater writers understand that and embrace that. Now, I don't know about you, and maybe it's because I'm a lyricist as well, I like to start with the title. I like to try and find the title of the song as early as I can. Do you feel that way?
I do feel like I start with the job it has to do, its assignment, and I actually learned that from you. I don't know if you remember, but I was in an ASCAP, and you were the first kind person to do ASCAP that didn't shame and blame. And there was an ability for you to see the show that we were trying to make, as opposed to blame us or humiliate us for what we hadn't done or for who we were mimicking, because, you know, I don't think you went through this. I don't hear that.
Of course I did.
I don't think you went through that derivative time in your
Oh,
work,
yes.
though.
Oh,
Who are
please.
you? I don't hear derivative in Godspell. I don't hear
feel
it.
like everything I do is derivative.
Of whom? Who is in Godspell? I don't hear it.
Oh, I could go through every single song in Godspell and say, that's the Supremes. That is the Mamas and the Papas. That's a James Taylor song.
Perhaps for you, but it's not to the ear. No, I would say not to the ear.
But, this is, I know we've gone off the question we were discussing for a minute, but I'm interested to hear you talk about this as well. People say to me, I so recognize your style. Like, I can hear a song and I either know it's yours or I know it's someone who's been influenced by your style. But from the inside, I don't think it doesn't feel to me like I have a style.
Oh, I agree with that for myself. I don't hear it. I just feel like, as you said, that fog, which I will never forget about, the process to me is about what's the next thing to write. And then you look back on it and think, okay, now what do we do?
And you're using what your building blocks, if you will, to change metaphors, are the things you've heard that you loved. You know, the folk music that you listened to as a child, this particular chord change that Mr. Beethoven did, you know, that fantastic way of finishing up a song that you heard, you know, Stephen Sondheim button a song in an amazing way, and you've assimilated all these things. And then I feel like I'm piecing together things based on what I loved and wanted to hear and would still like to hear, and making something out of it to tell this particular story. And that's what the song is. And so from the inside, that's what it feels like. It doesn't feel as if, you know, I have this style that I'm just, you know, painting away with. You know, it feels like like building it. And I don't mean to imply that it's laborious or, well, it is laborious, but I don't mean to imply that inspiration is not involved.
Right. The mystery.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
It's absolutely
Those
true.
leaps
Right.
that you do all this kind of preparation and you feel as if I'm not getting anywhere, I'm just hitting a brick wall, you know, I've run dry, I have nothing. And then, if you keep plugging away at it, then all of a sudden a leap happens and you suddenly have something. And you're not even quite sure, how did that happen?
Are you directing yourself as you write? Are you pulling out the camera to just say, you know what, this big thing, and then you come back and then you pull out? Are you in it?
Well, the only thing I would say about that is that I think, particularly because we're having a discussion that others who maybe want to do what we do will listen to, I think there's really a cautionary note to be sounded here. And I do want to tell a story about writer's block. People say to me, do you experience writer's block? And I don't really. But one time, which was when I was working on Hunchback of Notre Dame for a while with one song or another, I forget what it was, but it was almost like the movie cliche of the writer at the typewriter and then pulling the paper out and crumpling it and throwing on the floor. You know, that much.
And then cut to.
Right, the montage of writer's
right.
block. And in fact, speaking of my friend John Bacchino, I called him after a couple of days of this real frustration where I wasn't getting anywhere and was kind of whining to him about it. And he said, oh, well, you're being the editor too soon, which is the smartest thing anyone's ever said to me about writing. And of course, the minute I heard that, I realized that what we naturally do as writers is constantly change hats.
Yes.
We're the writer who just pours the stuff out without judgment. And then we're the editor who selects this, I'm going to use this is good, this thing that I wrote is, I think is worth keeping or pursuing, this is not good. But if that process gets short-circuited, so before the writer can get anything out, the editor is judging it, you're doomed. And that's what creates writer's block. So once I heard that and really understood it, then it's never easy, but then you just let yourself do bad work. You know, I have a friend who's a screenwriter, and whenever he starts a new movie, he titles on his computer, the first time he goes through it, he calls it shitty first draft, to give himself permission to write stuff that's not good.
But I think that's why I write in pencil. I write in pencil so I can erase. I don't write in anything else. And we were talking about being at a keyboard and walking around, and you were saying that you go then to the couch to allow the mysteries to come in. But I think one important lesson that I have to really think about is to embrace staying inside the abstract without any concrete, to just say, just do it.
Just do it.
Just, you know.
Then you'll fix it.
Right.
You know, I mean, and the other thing that I think young writers, I see this happen all the time in their fear of change, you can always retreat.
Right.
I remember writing Wicked that I had written this first song for Elphaba, the I Want song, which was called Making Good, and which was a really cool title. And it was a pretty good song, but I could just feel as we were doing readings, it wasn't really doing what you want that character to come out, and when she sings, you want the roof to come off. And it wasn't doing that. It was perfectly acceptable, but not doing that. And so finally I said to my colleagues, you know, I'm gonna just write something else here. And they were so terrified because there was a pretty good thing there. And I just said, well, if I don't do better, we always have this. It's not like Etch-a-Sketch where you're gonna shake it up and you're never gonna be able to find it again. We can always retreat. And I think that's comforting to remember too, that nothing is lost. You know, I can be in the 4th year of a show and talking to the book writer and we're struggling about a scene and, you know, suddenly saying, remember that thing you wrote 3 years ago?
Right.
That little, you know, those 6 lines. Could we find those again? Because I think maybe that was it, you know? And as long as, you know, you're remembering your history,
right,
you find those things and they're not lost.
I want to talk about how we champion each other's work. And You know, as we teach each other, I wonder a couple of things. One is, you know, when you did something like Working, which is one of the most important shows to me because it brought all these voices together. It seems emblematic of what you've also done in your career. And I thought all of these artists are working towards one thing.
One goal.
And I wonder if you can talk about the importance of doing a show like Working, what you learn from teaching, and what you hope people who will be listening to us can do at any age for each other and people following in their footsteps.
Well, I mean, look, we did this in the first place because we fell in love with this form, with musical theater, with telling stories through popular song and this kind of collaboration. But we're all very fragile creatures. So in nurturing each other, we're nurturing this form that we fell in love with, number one. Number two, that sounds incredibly altruistic. And the truth is, there's a really selfish component because every time you teach somebody, you learn probably more than they do. You hear what you're saying, just the fact that you've articulated it clarifies it for you. You see what other people are doing in their work that you wouldn't have thought of, and you can learn lessons from it. So, you know, there's quite a self-interested component in it too. And then, you know, you and I are both parents, and you know what it feels like when you see your child start to come into his or her own, start to have their own kind of power.
I wondered about that, and I wondered how old your kids were when you wrote Fathers and Sons.
Well, in fact, my son was about 3.5, and so I kind of wrote it about him. And I remember, you know, Fathers and Sons, people from time to time say, like, well, how do you write a song? And I have this sort of like glib catchphrase that I've developed, but I think it's worth saying here, which is tell the truth and make it rhyme. And what I've learned is if you tell the truth, both lyrically and or musically, it's scary. You leave yourself so vulnerable, and it feels as if everybody's going to know everything about me, and I'm totally exposed. But what happens is, in a way, the opposite. What happens is, they feel like you know everything about them.
Right.
Because we all resonate in some way as human beings in a similar way.
Heard a lot of songs say, where you going, my son? Now I know they're true. Boy, you never stop to think how fast the years run. Now they've taken you. I remember you was 3.5. Your ma and me, we'd sit there after things got quieted. Laugh at some new word you said, how tough you were to get to bed, and we'd plan the night away, planning for our kid. I was your hero then. I couldn't do no wrong as far as you were concerned. You thought I was the best of men. The tables hadn't turned, you hadn't learned how little time it takes, and daddies make mistakes. Seems to me that lately I've been thinking a lot. I think about my dad. Lots of funny things come back I thought I'd forgot. Now they make me sad. High school and it used to be. I didn't want him touching me, and I shuddered if he did. Further back to summer nights, baseball games beneath the lights, and sleeping in the car, my daddy and his kid. He was my hero then. He couldn't do no wrong as far as I was concerned. I thought he was the wisest and the strongest and the best of men. The tables hadn't turned, I hadn't learned how little time it takes, and everybody breaks, and daddies make mistakes. Songs say, where you going, my son? Now I know they're for real. Boy, you never stop to think how fast the years run, or the things they steal. Now it seems I always knew why I do the things I do and the things I never did. Why I work my whole damn life so's I could give a better life than the one my dad could give me. I give it to my